The snow gently dusted the tracks as the train pulled into Dust Creek just after sundown. Ella sat alone by the window, watching the small town take shape through the glass. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her ticket, her only possession after being wrongly accused of theft. The train had been long, tiring, and cold. She'd worn her borrowed wedding dress for the journey, the fabric too large for her, and the sleeves too long. But it was all she had, a cheap dress for a cheap marriage. Her thoughts wandered back to the events that had forced her to flee. It had been a misunderstanding, one that no one believed, not even the man she'd worked for. The accusations were enough to have her kicked out with nothing, not even the wages owed to her. She had walked the streets for days before finally receiving a letter from a stranger, a rancher named Jed Carter, who had promised a new life, a chance to escape. Desperation had led her here. As the train ground to a halt, Ella stood with a sigh. The other passengers quickly moved toward their families, exchanging hugs and laughter. But not her. She was alone in a sea of warmth and joy, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, clutching the dress that seemed to weigh her down more than the cold. A man waited at the gate as the train doors opened, his silhouette sharp against the dimming light. Tom, the wagon driver, waved at her. His face was gruff, but there was something kind in his eyes. He was a man of few words, but his presence was reassuring. "You Ella?" he asked gruffly. "Yes," she replied, her voice shaky. She was unsure of what to expect, but at least she had a ride to wherever she was headed. Tom didn't waste time with pleasantries. As they rolled through town, Ella couldn't help but notice how festive everything looked. The Christmas decorations lit up the streets, and the bells of the church rang in the distance. She saw the bank, its grand structure rising above the smaller buildings, and as they passed by the town center, she noticed the fancy homes on the hill. Everything here seemed prosperous, but as the wagon turned toward the outskirts, her heart sank. This was not what she had imagined. The ranch they approached was small, humble even, with only a single light flickering from the window. There were no grand gates, no welcoming family, just the cold wind sweeping across the barren fields. Tom stopped the wagon and helped her down. "This is it," he said flatly, turning the horses around without another word. Ella stepped hesitantly toward the house. The door creaked open before she could knock. There stood the man she had come for, Jed Carter. He was tall, his face weathered, a strong build, but the quiet demeanor of someone who had lived through hardships. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak as he stood in the doorway, just motioned for her to come inside. Ella swallowed nervously, unsure of what to say. "I'm Ella. I'm here to... Well, I'm here to marry you," she said, her words coming out more like a question than a statement. Jed didn't respond. He simply held up a hand, signaling that she should wait. His notepad appeared, and he scribbled something before showing it to her. "Lost my voice years ago. Rest tonight. We talk in the morning." She blinked in surprise. No voice. She nodded slowly, taking in the stillness around them. The inside of the house was plain but tidy, with a warmth that suggested care despite its simplicity. A single lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. There were no luxuries, no comforts, just the bare essentials. Yet, there was something elegant about the space, something Ella couldn't quite place. She glanced down at his hands as they gestured for her to sit. They were calloused, worn from years of hard work. But there was something refined about them, too. Clean nails, the hint of someone who knew both the labor of the land and the polish of wealth. It didn't make sense. As she sat down, trying to make herself comfortable in the small, unfamiliar space, she noticed how neat everything was, yet how starkly it contrasted with the town she had just passed. This was no ordinary ranch. There was something hidden here, something he wasn't ready to share. The night stretched on, and soon, the town's church bells rang midnight. Ella lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound was soothing, but her thoughts raced. She had come here expecting to marry a man who owned nothing, who was as desperate as she was. But now, in the quiet of the night, the truth felt much more complicated. Unable to sleep, Ella crept downstairs, her bare feet quiet on the wooden floors. She found Jed sitting by the fire, a ledger open in his hands. He quickly closed it as she entered, the act so swift it made her wonder what he had been looking at. She hesitated for a moment, then approached, sitting in the chair beside him. He didn't speak, just handed her a small wooden comb, intricately carved, a gift. She was touched by the gesture. "I have nothing to give," she murmured, her voice quiet in the stillness of the room. He wrote in his notepad again, his hand steady. "Company. First in 5 years." She smiled, grateful, even if the oddness of their situation left her unsettled. Just then, a shadow moved outside the window, a carriage pulling up silently in the dark. A well-dressed man stepped out, his footsteps muffled by the snow. Jed tensed immediately. His hand shot up, motioning for Ella to go upstairs. She obeyed, her heart pounding. She hid at the top of the stairs, peering down as the stranger's voice carried inside. "Town council knows about your arrangement. If they discover who you really are and that you've brought a woman here, this won't end well, Carter. Not again." Ella's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? And what was Jed hiding? The carriage pulled away, but Ella remained frozen in place, the words echoing in her mind. Not again. The mystery of Jed Carter was only beginning to unfold. The next morning, Ella awoke to find the house still shrouded in silence. The fire was low, and Jed was gone, leaving only a note on the kitchen table. "Business in town. Back afternoon." The morning light filtered weakly through the windows, casting long shadows across the sparse room. Ella stared at the note for a moment, her thoughts racing. The events of the night before felt like a dream, something too strange to be real. She had come here thinking she was marrying a poor rancher, only to uncover the first whispers of a hidden life. She sat at the table, feeling the weight of everything she had yet to discover, then slowly rose to explore the house. The small ranch was modest, but had an underlying quality of careful organization and order. She moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb something delicate, until she stumbled upon a door leading to what appeared to be a study. Inside, the room was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp on a corner desk, but there were signs that this was no ordinary rancher space. Maps of the town were tacked to the walls, with various properties marked in a meticulous hand. Legal documents lay in stacks, and the most curious item of all was a set of neatly pressed newspaper clippings from years ago, all talking about an anonymous benefactor who had quietly saved the town from financial ruin. As she flipped through the clippings, a photograph caught her eye. Young Jed, dressed in a fine suit, standing before a grand building. The contrast was so stark, so out of place with the man she had met the night before, that she could hardly believe it. It was then that she noticed the safe in the corner of the room, locked and unopened. It was clear that there were secrets here, secrets that Jed had never planned to share. Confused, Ella left the study, and as she stepped outside, she caught sight of Tom returning with a wagon full of supplies. Tom had been kind enough to give her a ride into town the previous evening, but now his face looked troubled. He was clearly nervous about something. When Ella approached him, her eyes wide with questions, he hesitated, clearly not wanting to divulge too much. "Who is Jed Carter really?" she asked boldly, needing answers. Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Not my place to say," he muttered, but Ella pressed on. "The man last night seemed afraid for me," she said, recalling the way Jed had reacted to the stranger's visit. "You're right to feel that way," Tom finally admitted, his voice low. "Jed's got reasons for hiding. Good ones. But you being here complicates that." He hesitated, then added, "Half this town owes him everything. The other half They want him dead. Ella felt the blood drain from her face as she absorbed his words. You being here, it's going to make things worse. Before she could ask more, Tom quickly turned and left, leaving her standing in the middle of the yard, feeling more lost than ever. That afternoon, unable to wait any longer for Jed to return, Ella decided to venture into Dust Creek herself. She was determined to find out the truth, to understand who the man was that she had unknowingly bound her future to. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked through the quiet streets. Christmas had passed, but the decorations remained, hanging on the windows and doors like a fragile reminder of happier times. The air was crisp, the wind biting at her face as she passed the general store. When she walked inside, the bell on the door jingled, and Mrs. Halloway, the elderly shopkeeper, looked up in surprise. "You're at the Carter Ranch?" she asked, clearly shocked. Ella nodded slowly, watching the woman's face closely. "Does he know you're here?" Mrs. Halloway asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yes, he knows," Ella replied, though she wasn't sure what that even meant. "Well, let me tell you," Mrs. Halloway said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Jed Carter didn't start out as some poor rancher. He inherited a fortune when his father died. But that wasn't the story he wanted people to know. He came here 10 years ago, bought up failing businesses, saved the town from collapsing. The bank, the commercial buildings, all of it. He owns it." Ella's mind spun as Mrs. Halloway continued. "He never raised rents. He kept everyone employed, even when things were bad. But he never flaunted his wealth. Lived simply. Never asked for thanks. That's why people don't really know. They don't understand. He never wanted them to." Ella felt a deep sense of disbelief. She had known there was more to Jed than met the eye, but she hadn't imagined this. "But why would he hide all of this?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Mrs. Halloway sighed. 5 years ago, he was engaged to a Comanche woman, Ayanna. The mayor, he tried to seize Jed's land and business. And when Jed fought back, well, things got ugly. Ayanna was killed in the attack on their ranch. They burned it to the ground. After that, Jed stopped speaking. He retreated, hid himself away. She paused, her voice softening. "He's lived like a hermit since, hiding his wealth, hiding his heart." Ella stared at Mrs. Halloway, trying to process everything she had just learned. The man she had married, sight unseen, was a man of wealth and power. Yet he had chosen to live in the shadows, hiding not just from the world but from his own pain. She was no longer sure if she was the one who had to be saved. Later, as she made her way back to the ranch, a chill ran down her spine. She had just discovered the truth about Jed, and yet that truth had only led to more questions. As she neared the edge of town, she caught sight of 3 rough-looking men blocking her path. They were on horseback, their eyes cold and hard as they watched her approach. The leader smirked as she came closer. "So Carter finally got himself another woman," he said, his tone mocking. "Tell him we remember Ayanna, and we remember who he really is. He can't hide behind poverty forever." They let her pass, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that they were following her, their horses moving at a slow, deliberate pace behind her. She picked up the pace, her heart racing. She turned down the familiar road leading back to the ranch, but when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw them, still coming. Panic began to rise in her chest. She had just led them straight to Jed. They would find him now. The danger was real. And the mystery of Jed Carter, his wealth, his past, and the hidden forces at work, had only just begun to unfold. Ella barely had time to catch her breath before she reached the ranch. Her heart was pounding in her chest, not just from the fast walk, but from the realization of what she had done. She had led those men right to Jed. She barely had time to gather her thoughts when she burst through the door, her breath coming in quick gasps. Jed was standing by the window, watching her with a calm expression that only seemed to deepen her anxiety. Without saying a word, he motioned for her to come inside, his eyes studying her every move. She could see the concern in them, But she had no time for gentle pleasantries. She needed answers. "Jed," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I've been to town. I know the truth now." Jed's eyes flickered to hers, and he reached for the notepad that he always kept close. He wrote quickly and handed it to her. "What happened?" Ella exhaled, shaking her head. "I didn't know. I didn't know any of it. You're not poor, Jed. You own the town." The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, and she wasn't sure how to continue. "Why did you hide it from me? Why did you let me think you were just some poor rancher?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but there was an edge of betrayal in it. Jed didn't speak immediately. He took the notepad back and began writing again. His handwriting was steady, careful, as if he had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in his head, words that had never made it past his lips. Finally, he handed her the paper. "Would you have come if you knew?" The question hit her like a slap. Would she have? She thought about her situation, about the desperation that had driven her here in the first place. "I don't know," she admitted softly, the truth uncomfortable on her tongue. "I came because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't come for money. I didn't come for your wealth." Jed looked at her, his gaze intense. He didn't write this time, but simply nodded. "Exactly," he had meant to say. "You chose me, not my fortune." His words, though silent, carried a depth of understanding that left Ellis speechless. The anger she had been holding on to began to melt away, replaced with something far more complex: empathy. She had come here thinking she was the one who had nothing, but in truth, they were both running from something. And now, they were both here, together. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, before Jed finally spoke. Not with his voice, but with his pen. "I was protecting myself. And you." Ella swallowed hard. "From what?" He didn't write this time, but stood, moving toward a wooden chest that had been tucked away in the corner of the room. He opened it slowly, revealing a small stack of papers and a few personal belongings. He pulled out a bundle of letters, carefully untying the string that held them together. As he handed them to her, he began to write again, the pen moving quickly across the paper. "After Ayana's death, I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in that town knowing I'd failed her. I thought maybe if I gave up everything, I would stop feeling the guilt. But the pain didn't go away." Ella's heart ached as she read the words. She knew nothing of Ayana, but the raw emotion in Jed's writing spoke volumes. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw the true weight he carried. The tragedy that had defined his life for the past 5 years was not something he had chosen. It was something that had been forced upon him. He had retreated into silence, into solitude, because the world had taken everything from him. And now, he was offering her the only thing he had left: himself. "Jed," she said softly, "I'm not here to fix you. I'm not here to make your past go away." He looked at her with those quiet eyes, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something there. Hope, perhaps. "I never asked you to fix me," he wrote. "I just wanted to live. But I won't risk you." Ella reached out, taking his hand in hers. The strength of his grip was like a promise, a vow that he would protect her in his own way, even if it meant keeping the truth locked away. "What if I want to risk myself?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes softened, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw a glimmer of something more. A man who had been hiding, not just from the world, but from the possibility of something better, something real. He reached for her, but before he could speak, the world outside came crashing in. A loud crash echoed through the room, and Ella froze, her blood running cold. Rocks shattered through the window, and before she could even react, she heard the angry shouts of men outside. "Carter," they yelled, "we know you're in there." Jed moved quickly, his face hardening with the cold mask of someone who had lived through too much. He grabbed Ella's hand and pulled her toward the back of the house. The urgency in his movements told her everything she needed to know. "Cellar. Hide. Now." He was writing fast now, the words almost spilling from his pen as he urged her forward. Ella hesitated, her feet frozen in place. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I won't leave you." But Jed was already pulling out a rifle from behind the cupboard, his hands shaking as he loaded it. His voice cracked as he spoke, the pain from years of silence bleeding into his words. "You have to go." But she couldn't. She wouldn't. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice rising in desperation. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the ledgers and property documents that were scattered across the table. She grabbed them quickly, thrusting them into her arms. "If you own this town, make them remember," she said. Jed stopped for a moment, his eyes searching hers. There was something in his gaze, something fierce, something determined. He nodded once, and without another word, they both walked toward the front porch. The men outside were still shouting, still circling the house, but now they had an audience of one. Ella. She stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. The men stopped, their eyes narrowing as they took in her presence. "My name is Ella Carter," she said boldly, her voice steady despite the fear that clung to her every word. "I'm Jed Carter's wife, and I'm holding documents that prove he owns your mortgages, your land, and your futures. You can burn this house down tonight, but come morning, his bank will call in every debt. Every single one." The leader of the group, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. He looked at her with contempt, his lip curling into a sneer. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. But Ella held her ground, just as she thought the standoff might break. Jed stepped out onto the porch beside her. He didn't speak, didn't write, didn't even look at her. He simply nodded once, his face a mask of calm determination. That single nod was all it took to confirm everything. The men outside knew then that they were in the presence of something far more dangerous than they had bargained for. The standoff continued in silence, the tension crackling in the cold air. Ella's heart raced, but she didn't back down. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, whatever came next. The air outside the ranch felt heavier than it had before, thick with uncertainty. As the men on horseback slowly retreated, their eyes still burning with resentment, Ella stood firm on the porch, her pulse racing, yet strangely calm. She had spoken, and Jed had backed her, without saying a word, without offering a single explanation. It was enough to unsettle the group, to make them reconsider their next move, but their departure didn't signal the end of the threat. No, it only delayed it. As the horses faded into the distance, the chill of the night seemed to cling to Ella's skin, reminding her that this was only the beginning. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense. Once the door clicked shut behind them, Jed turned to her, his eyes still haunted, his body tense as if expecting another attack. She felt the weight of his gaze, the silent gratitude that he wasn't able to express in words, and yet the deeper, unspoken burden he carried. He wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the paper with urgent precision. "That's not over. Tomorrow, town council. They'll want answers. We'll have to face them." Ella nodded, absorbing his words. They both knew what was at stake now. His silence, his avoidance, it could no longer protect them. The town was bound to find out who he really was, and she, as his wife, would have to face the judgment alongside him. It wasn't just about saving the town anymore. It wasn't about Jed's secret fortune or the lingering ghosts of Ayanna. It was about the life they were about to build together, and whether that would be enough to silence those who wanted him gone. As Jed prepared himself for what the morning would bring, Ella couldn't help but reflect on the man who had become her husband in name, but not yet fully in heart. The man she had met was not the same as the one standing before her now. The silence between them was broken only by his written words, his careful actions, and the brief moments of shared looks. And yet, she could sense that the man who had hidden from the world for so long was not yet ready to show himself completely, to reveal the fullness of who he was to her. She saw the change in him, the small shift that indicated he was beginning to trust her, beginning to lean into the love he had so long avoided. But the truth, the real truth, had not yet been spoken. Ella knew the consequences of this. She had learned enough about him to understand that his silence was not just a result of his past, but a defense mechanism against the pain he feared might come with the love he so clearly wanted to offer. But she wasn't afraid of that pain. Not anymore. She would stand by him, no matter the storm that would surely follow. The night passed quietly. The storm of the previous hours had died down, leaving only the cold to press in around them. Ella slept fitfully, her thoughts a swirl of uncertainty and determination. She could no longer hide from the truth of who Jed was. He was a man of great wealth, yes, but more importantly, he was a man marked by tragedy, forced to bury his heart in the shadows of his past. And yet here she was. She wasn't running anymore. When morning finally arrived, gray and cold, the tension between them was palpable. Jed didn't say a word as he dressed in one of his fine suits, carefully selecting each item as though preparing for battle. The clothes felt like a costume to Ella, a reminder of the man he had been before the world had crushed him. She watched as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his expression distant, as if bracing himself for what lay ahead. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for the courage to face what was coming. She met his gaze steadily. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. Jed's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he turned and began to gather his things. The carriage was waiting outside, ready to take them to town. The town that would now know the truth. The town that would either accept Jed for who he was, or push him back into the shadows he had spent so long hiding in. As they climbed into the carriage, the weight of the moment pressed down on Ella's shoulders. She had known deep down that this was coming, that the world couldn't remain unaware of Jed's true identity forever. But now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the consequences. The town square was as cold as the day before. The streets, usually bustling with life, were eerily quiet, as if the town itself held its breath. The church bells rang in the distance, but there was no festive cheer in the air this time. The fire from the previous night still smoldered in the distance, a dark reminder of the anger and fear that had been building for years. As they entered the square, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, staring at them with mixed expressions of curiosity, suspicion, and, Ella could have sworn, fear. They were not just walking into a public trial. They were walking into a storm. The doors to the town hall loomed in front of them. The mayor, a man whose face was unfamiliar but whose eyes were cold and calculating, stood at the front of the room. The town council members sat in their seats, waiting for the confrontation to begin. The murmurs of the crowd died down as they entered, their presence a sharp contrast to the usual calm of the hall. The mayor gestured to Jed. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you have been summoned here today to answer for your actions. The fire at the church was a result of your decision to hide in the shadows for too long. We need to know the truth." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. The truth. They had come for it, demanding it with every eye upon them. The room fell silent, every ear straining to hear Jed speak. But as always, Jed remained silent, his face impassive. He reached for his notepad, his hand steady as he wrote, "I didn't set the fire. I was at the ranch with my wife, preparing for this meeting." The mayor looked skeptical, but the crowd seemed to relax, if only slightly. But then, one of the councilmen, a tall man with a hard look in his eyes, stood. "Mr. Carter," he said, "it's not just the fire we're concerned about. It's your hidden wealth. Why you let this town live in the dark while you hold the strings? You have money, power. Why not share it?" Jed took a deep breath, and for the first time, his eyes met Ella's. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, an apology, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the weight they both carried. He began to write again. "I wanted to help. I wanted to save this town, but I didn't want to be seen as a savior. I wanted to give without taking credit. The mayor leaned forward, his voice softer now. But why keep it a secret? Why hide? Jed's answer was simple, written in clear, measured words. Because I couldn't bear the attention. Because I was afraid of losing it all again. There it was, the confession, the truth that had been buried for so long. And in that moment, Ella realized something that she hadn't fully understood before. This man, this quiet, broken rancher, had given everything he had to the town. He had been living in fear, not of the world, but of the people he had saved. He had been hiding because he was terrified of what would happen if they ever saw him for who he truly was. And now, standing beside him, she understood. He wasn't just a man hiding from his past. He was a man afraid to embrace his future. As the room remained still, waiting for the next move, Ella made her decision. She stepped forward, her voice strong and clear as she spoke to the council. Jed Carter saved this town. He has given everything to this community. And if you want to blame anyone for his silence, blame the men who forced him to hide in the first place. She turned to Jed, her eyes filled with determination. "No more hiding, Jed," she said softly. "No more running." The mayor looked at her, then at Jed, and finally the rest of the council. There was no immediate response, no declaration. But there was something else, a shift in the air. Something had changed. And for the first time, Ella felt a flicker of hope. The town hall remained thick with tension, the air heavy as Jed and Ella stood side by side, awaiting the final judgment. The mayor had asked his questions, and while the room seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of how to respond, the truth had been spoken. Jed's silence, his wealth, his deep-seated fears had all come to light, and now it was clear, no matter how hard they tried to hide it, the truth could not be buried. The crowd had begun to murmur, the anger of those who once sought to tear Jed down, now tempered with uncertainty. His story had rattled them, shaken the very foundation of their beliefs. It was one thing to blame the rich man who kept his wealth hidden. It was another entirely to hear the pain in his voice, the depth of loss that had driven him into the shadows. The townspeople had come expecting a confrontation, but now they found themselves facing something much deeper: humanity. And for a moment, it seemed as if the walls between Jed and the town, built up over years of mistrust and fear, might begin to crumble. As the mayor prepared to speak again, the heavy wooden doors of the hall slammed open, and a figure stepped inside, a young man, disheveled, with a look of panic in his eyes. His voice was shaky as he called out, "Mr. Carter, you need to come quick. It's the church. It's on fire again." Gasps rippled through the room as the news spread. The fire, which had barely been extinguished the night before, was now threatening to consume the entire building. It was as if the flames themselves had returned to test the very foundation of the town, to challenge Jed's presence here. The mayor, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief, quickly stood. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "The church is already burning." "It's not." But before he could finish, the young man spoke again, his voice filled with urgency. "No, sir, you don't understand. This time, the fire was set intentionally, and there's someone to blame." The room went silent. I turned to the doors, waiting for the news to unfold, for the answers that would reveal who was behind this second act of destruction. Jed's gaze hardened. He could feel it in his gut. This was no random accident. Someone had set the fire deliberately. Someone wanted to make sure that his name was dragged through the mud, that his return to the town would be met with violence, not healing. He looked at Ella, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The truth they had just spoken, the words of acceptance and understanding, felt suddenly fragile, as if a single gust of wind could blow them away. Jed clenched his fists. The fire at the church was no longer just an act of arson. It was an act of war, a statement, a calculated attempt to strip him of any remaining dignity. This town had already turned its back on him once before, and now it seemed they were determined to do it again. But this time he wouldn't back down. He had given enough of his life to this place, enough of his soul. He had let them hide behind their lies, their fears, for far too long. No more. With a final glance at Ella, he moved quickly, heading toward the door, his every step steady and purposeful. The town needed to see the truth now, to understand that the man they had shunned was not the villain they had made him out to be. He would stand tall. He would face the fire. And this time, he wouldn't do it alone. As they arrived at the church, the sight that greeted them was grim. The flames were higher now, licking at the wooden beams, threatening to consume everything in their path. The once pristine structure, the heart of the town, was now a shadow of its former self. Smoke poured into the sky, thick and choking. The firefighters, exhausted from the previous night's efforts, were struggling to keep the blaze under control. The town square was crowded, people gathering in fear and confusion, their faces filled with a mixture of anger and helplessness. But as Jed and Ella made their way through the crowd, something shifted. Eyes turned toward them, not with suspicion, but with a kind of begrudging respect. It was clear that the fire had made them realize something important, that Jed Carter was not the enemy. He was the man who had saved them, the one who had kept them afloat when the rest of the world had turned its back. As they reached the edge of the fire, a shout came from the crowd. "There he is!" A figure appeared, stepping forward with a furious expression, his eyes wild with rage. It was Sullivan, the same man who had threatened them the night before, the one who had made his presence felt in the town hall. He was carrying a torch, his hands shaking as he pointed it toward Jed. "You did this, didn't you?" he shouted, his voice thick with accusation. "You set the fire to destroy this town once and for all. You think you can buy us all off with your money? You think you can hide your shameful past and just walk back in like you own the place? Well, it's time to pay, Carter. It's time for you to get what you deserve." The crowd seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Sullivan's words were like a spark, igniting the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. They had been waiting for someone to blame, and now Sullivan had given them their answer. But Jed didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes locked on his Sullivan's with a calmness that sent a ripple through the crowd. He didn't need to speak. His silence was a statement in itself. He had nothing to prove to these people anymore. His actions had spoken for him. "No, Sullivan." Ella's voice rang out clear and firm. "Jed didn't start this fire. You did. You and your cronies. You've been trying to destroy him for years, and now you're trying to destroy this town all over again. But we won't let you." The crowd stirred, the shift in their energy undeniable. For the first time, they were no longer looking to Jed as the villain. They were looking at Sullivan as the enemy. Sullivan's face twisted with rage, his eyes flashing with fury as he lunged forward, but the sheriff, having arrived in the nick of time, stepped between them. "Enough," he barked. "We'll have no more violence here. The truth will come out, and you, Sullivan, will face the consequences of your actions." As Sullivan was dragged away, shouting threats and curses, the crowd began to murmur. There were no cheers, no loud proclamations of victory, but something had changed. They had seen the truth, and they could no longer deny it. Jed Carter had been a man of mystery, a man of silence. But now, he was a man of strength. The fire was still burning, but it no longer held the power to destroy. It was a symbol now, a turning point, a chance for the town to rebuild from the ashes. And as Ella watched Jed, standing tall among the ruins, she realized that this wasn't just a battle for the town. It was a battle for him, for them. Together, they would face whatever came next, and this time, they wouldn't hide. The night had barely passed before the full weight of the events began to settle over Ella and Jed, their emotions raw and unresolved. Sullivan's arrest had hardly brought peace to the town. In fact, the whispers of blame for the church fire still lingered in the corners of the town square, like the smoke that still curled into the sky from the burning church. But for now, that would have to wait. Ella stayed by Jed's side as he was examined by the doctor. His wound from the gunshot wound still fresh and painful, but not life-threatening. The doctor had assured her that he would survive, that the bullet had only grazed his shoulder and would heal with time. Still, the sight of the blood-soaked fabric against his skin made her stomach turn. She hadn't signed up for this kind of life. She had only wanted to escape her past, to find a place where she could be safe. But now, as she sat beside Jed in the sterile quiet of the doctor's office, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for him, for them. She would stand with him no matter what came next. As the days passed, Jed's condition improved, but so did their relationship. It wasn't instant. It wasn't easy, but slowly, day by day, they began to find their rhythm. Ella helped him dress and bathe, even when he was too proud to let her. She'd sit with him while he scribbled his thoughts on paper, knowing that he still couldn't speak. She became the bridge for their shared silence, the translator of his thoughts, his needs, his wishes. And every day, she saw him change bit by bit. He was beginning to speak again, his voice still weak, still shaky, but it was enough. He had told her the truth, and now he was beginning to reclaim his life, even as he began to let her into the parts of him he had long locked away. But it wasn't just his recovery that mattered. It was the town, too. The threat of Sullivan and his supporters still hung over them. But there was something different now. After the church fire, the town had no choice but to reckon with the truth. People who had once looked at Jed with suspicion, fear, and anger now saw him as something else entirely. A man who had given everything to them, even if they hadn't known it. Even if they hadn't wanted to know it. As Christmas approached, the feeling in the town began to change. The whispers of conspiracy and betrayal began to die down, replaced by something warmer, something more welcoming. The fire had destroyed much, but it had also opened up the possibility of healing. There were still those who hated Jed for his wealth, for his secrecy, but they were a minority now. The majority, the ones whose lives Jed had quietly saved, began to rally around him, beginning to accept that his wealth wasn't the curse they had believed it to be. There were still challenges ahead. The town council still needed to address Jed's holdings openly, and the tensions between the old and new order would take time to heal. But for now, they were moving in the right direction. The community was beginning to understand that Jed's wealth had always been a tool, not a weapon. The day before Christmas Eve, Jed and Ella walked together into the town square, the sun low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the snow-dusted streets. The air was crisp, but not bitter. The town seemed different now. The same decorations hung from the storefronts, the same bells rang from the church tower, but there was a new sense of calm, of quiet respect. "You're not hiding anymore," Ella said softly, looking up at him. Jed gave her a small smile, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "No," he wrote, his hand steady as always. "And I don't think I ever will again." That night, they held a simple celebration at the ranch. There was no grand feast, no fanfare, just a small fire in the hearth, 2 mugs of hot cider, and a shared peace between 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. Jed was healing, and so was she. They both had scars, both visible and hidden, but they were learning how to be whole together. When the door knocked, it was Tom, a familiar face with a broad grin on his weathered face. "Heard y'all were getting ready to celebrate. Thought I'd stop by," he said, holding a bundle of twigs in his hand. "Tom," Ella greeted him warmly, glad to see a friend amidst the chaos that had defined their lives so far. Tom stepped inside, setting the bundle down by the fire. "I don't much care for celebrations," he said, looking awkwardly between them. "But there's one thing I've learned over the years. When people go through hell together, they don't always come back out the same. But sometimes they come back better." Jed nodded, his gaze meeting Tom's with something approaching gratitude. So Tom continued, sitting down at the table, I figure maybe this Christmas things are changing. Maybe they'll change for the better. It's about damn time. And so, for the first time in years, there was a real celebration in Dust Creek. No one talked much about the fire anymore. Instead, the conversation turned to the future, to what could be rebuilt, to what was worth saving. There were no grand speeches, no declarations, just the quiet understanding that they had all been through something together and that somehow they had survived. Christmas morning arrived in Dust Creek with a quiet stillness, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. The world was white, the town was still, and the bells in the church tower rang gently in the distance. And in the midst of all of it, there was a small, simple ceremony at the ranch. It wasn't the grand wedding that many of the townsfolk had expected from a man like Jed Carter, but it was everything that mattered. Ella stood beside Jed as he took her hand, wearing the wedding dress that had once been stained with blood but now shimmered in the firelight. She felt her heart swell as she looked into his eyes that were no longer filled with the pain of his past, but with the hope of a future they could build together. "I promise to stand by you," Ella said softly, her voice steady. "In truth, in trouble, in joy, and in sorrow." Jed, his voice still weak but growing stronger, spoke the words he had never been able to speak before. "I promise to never hide who I am again, to build a life worthy of your courage, your love." The small ceremony was quiet, but the significance was not lost on them. In that moment, they both knew that they had come through something together. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met. They had both been broken in their own ways, but now they were whole. And as the sun set on Christmas Day, they stood hand in hand, looking out over the ranch, knowing that the future was uncertain, but that they would face it together. The town had begun to accept Jed for who he was, and the dark cloud that had hovered over them all for so long had finally begun to lift. The road ahead would not always be easy, but with Ella by his side, Jed knew that he could face whatever came next. As the first snow of the season began to fall, he pulled Ella close, holding her in the warmth of their small, humble home. "Merry Christmas, wife," he whispered, his voice cracked but full of love. "Merry Christmas, husband," she replied, her heart full. And in that moment, in the glow of the firelight and the falling snow, they both knew they had found something more valuable than all the wealth in the world: each other.